Well, thank you all for coming. This is the sixth in a series of lectures on adventures in foreign policy. And it's the first of three talks on the terrible fate of Cambodia after the Vietnamese War. In Cambodia, the Vietnamese War, continued for 15 years after our own and killed 40 times as many people as we lost soldiers in Vietnam. So the war in Vietnam had the most horrible collateral effects on the Cambodians, and those 2 million people who died horribly. I want to say that I learned two things in working on Cambodia. The first one was that while I always believed that small things could make a big difference, and this lecture series is based on that idea, I had always been working in the past on big issues, especially nuclear war, and so many people were involved, milling about, hundreds of experts on megatonnage and warheads and missiles, that it was hard to get traction and hard for one person to make a difference. It was also bloodless, because although the catastrophe that would result from nuclear war was really great and could destroy the entire civilization, it had a very low probability, and people talked about it in a very abstract way. But when I began working on Cambodia, I saw war as it is, blood, sweat, and tears, and I also saw a situation where there were so few experts working on Cambodia, and so few people in Washington cared about Cambodia, that one person could make a really major difference. And that's what you'll see in this talk today. Now, here is Vietnam, here, and here is Cambodia, this round part here. Above it is Laos, and here is Thailand. So this is my effort to prevent the United States from being involved in a second war in Indochina after the Vietnamese War, an effort to prevent the country from being sucked back in to a second Indochinese war. And I got involved in '89 and '90, and that's when most of this action took place. Now, first of all, it all started with President Nixon in '69 to '70, when he secretly began bombing Cambodia to deny the Vietnamese sanctuaries. The Vietnamese, Vietnam was here. This is Cambodia on the eastern side. The red is where the bombing took place. Cambodia was supposed to be a neutral nation, but the North Vietnamese were coming down through Cambodia and then back into Vietnam in order to circumvent the electronic battlefield and the other efforts that were made to prevent the North Vietnamese soldiers from descending into South Vietnam. So they had paths through here, and we thought they had command posts there, and we felt they were exploiting the neutrality of Cambodia. And at this time, Nixon was trying to withdraw from the war in Vietnam, and he wanted to show determination in the talks, and he wanted to degrade the North Vietnamese capability to use these sanctuaries, and this was very indiscriminate carpet bombing. They really didn't have targets there, and they really couldn't tell what effects the bombings were having because they didn't have observers there. And in order to maintain the bombing, President Nixon felt he had to keep it secret from the public, from the media, and from the Congress, because it was an unconstitutional expansion of the war from Vietnam into Cambodia. So as a result, they didn't really know exactly how effective it all was. And the B-52 bombers themselves were told they were going to bomb Vietnam, but then when they were in flight, some of them would be given instructions to peel off and go into Cambodia and bomb it. And so it was kept so secret, it was difficult, really, for them to figure out how well it was going. Now, it turns out that in Cambodia at the time, there was a kind of latent civil war. In the northeast of the country, there was an extremely radical communist movement called the Khmer Rouge. Cambodians are called Khmer, and Rouge means red. So these were the red Cambodians, the Khmer Rouge, and they were struggling to take over the country. This was their leader, Pol Pot. He had been trained in China in a super Maoist school, but he was even more Maoist than the Maoists, and he had very extreme ideas. And the terrible fact is that the bombing of Cambodia destabilized the country and permitted this communist faction to take over. So this was the very unfortunate effect. And Pol Pot, who'd been trained in Paris, he believed in a kind of agrarian communism. He considered the cities sinful. He wanted to empty the cities. He forced everyone to leave Phnom Penh, the capital. This is Phnom Penh with nobody in it. They were all forced to leave the capital. Here is Phnom Penh here. And they were taken into these villages, and they were told to start farming. They began to kill people. They began to kill educated people. If you spoke a foreign language, they killed you. If you were a doctor, they killed you. If you were a lawyer, they killed you. If they found you were speaking French to your wife at night, they killed you. They didn't want people who knew what the outside world was like. And they continued to kill people. Every year they were in power, especially in July, which was a kind of a killing month. And it was thought that they wanted to kill everyone that had been over 12 at the time of the revolution. They had told Zhou Enlai on his deathbed that they were going to create a new communist man really quickly. And Zhou Enlai knew the dangers in this, and he said to them, don't do that, don't do that, you know, don't try. And they were thinking, they were smiling when they left his deathbed. They said, you know, we're going to show the Chinese that we can make a communist man even better, faster than the Chinese can, and we know more. And so they finally, they eventually killed 20% of the population, 2 million Cambodians. These are the kind of skulls you see when you get to Cambodia, and they killed them in a terrible way. I mean, they didn't use bullets. They hit them with hose and picks, and they tortured them. They trained children to torture animals and then trained them to torture people. They told children, shoot that man, he's an enemy, and degraded them into cruelty. And they tried to set one part of the society against another. And it was the most horrific and terrible genocide that you can really imagine. Well, as the genocide continued, the government was being destabilized, and they did what you did historically in all situations like this. The governments create or involve a common enemy. They find an enemy, and they tell the public, you know, we're at war with an enemy, so you've got to rally around the government. So the historic enemy was Vietnam. So they began attacking Vietnamese villages on the border, right along here. And the Vietnamese decided that they had to do something about it, and they invaded Cambodia. They had a much stronger army. It had been trained in Vietnam. The Cambodians were exhausted. The Vietnamese had always been stronger, more agile, vigorous, you know, in things like this than the Cambodians. So they made short work of it, and they pushed the government, the Pol Pot government, into the jungles, back into this region. And so they found at the time the Vietnamese villages were being attacked, the eastern factions of the Khmer Rouge, which were around here, and which were more civilized because they were closer to Vietnam and they knew more about what was really going on. They realized that this was a terrible thing, attacking these villages, and they didn't want to do it. So 2 divisions defected. They went to Vietnam and they said, look, they're eventually going to kill us. Pol Pot has already said he's going to exterminate the Eastern Zone Khmer for not cooperating, and we would like you to permit our divisions to enter Vietnam as a sanctuary. So 2 divisions of the Khmer Rouge crossed the border, went into Vietnam, and Vietnam began to train them in their point of view about all this and what the war was really all about. And so then when they took over Phnom Penh, they found 2 leaders of these divisions, and they installed them in charge of the Cambodian government. Here they are, Hung Sen and Hun Sen. Hun Sen became the prime minister, and these became the leaders of this faction. Now, the most amazing thing here is how horrible was the attitude of the United States and China and the United Nations in general towards this new government. This new government had been set in place by the Vietnamese, who had been attacked, and they had overthrown genocidal monsters who'd killed 2 million people. And yet for 15 years, the United Nations did not recognize this new government and continued to recognize the genocidal murderers, the Pol Pot government, as a legitimate government of Cambodia, even though they were hidden in the jungle and had no influence on anything. You may ask, how on earth did that happen? Well, at that time, the United States was very anti-Vietnamese. It had lost the war to the Vietnamese, and it was angry at them, and the anti-Vietnamese feeling in the State Department was very strong. And in China, the Chinese and the Vietnamese had been enemies for 1,000 years. We had based the Vietnamese War on the misunderstanding that in fact they were allies, and that if the Vietnamese won, the Chinese would then proceed through Vietnam and take over Cambodia and Thailand and Malaysia. That was the domino theory. In fact, it missed the point that once the Vietnamese got whatever aid they needed from the Chinese to win the war, they weren't about to let the Chinese, use Vietnam and continue through them. And the Chinese knew that, and they made an ally out of Pol Pot, because that put China on one side of Vietnam and an ally of theirs on the other side of Vietnam. So they were encircling Vietnam and supporting Pol Pot. And they continued to support Pol Pot in the jungle by giving money to the Thai generals who would funnel aid to the guerrillas in the jungle and keep the war alive against the Vietnamese. So China and America persuaded the entire United Nations not to recognize this new government. And I asked Bill Colby, a former director of Central Intelligence Agency, how on earth did they persuade all those other countries to do this? And he said, Jeremy, you have to understand, all these countries in the United Nations have borders. And because they have borders, they're very much against anybody crossing borders. They all worry about factions of theirs, defecting of their own country. And so they're voting their national self-interest when they say, for no reason, even to upset genocidal monsters, are we recognizing governments installed that way. And anyway, they were under the influence of China and the United States, an unusual coalition and very powerful one. Now, at about this time, I hosted a man in my office in Washington, where I was running the Federation of American Scientists, who was a surgeon interested in the effects of herbicides in the Vietnamese War. The United States had used Agent Orange in the Vietnamese War to destroy the foliage that they felt was giving protection to the Vietnamese troops and the Viet Cong forces. So there was a lot of this agent sprayed over Vietnam, and it had bad Agent Orange effects on humans. And the Vietnamese were interested in scientific exchange on this, and they sent a surgeon to Washington. And I received him in '79, and he gave a lecture. And I said, well, we should certainly discuss this. I'd like to go to Vietnam to discuss this. And we had a lot of people in America, veterans, who were claiming that Agent Orange had harmed them, and the government was still doing studies and was denying that there was any harm. So this was an important issue to discuss. And so I was about to go to Vietnam when the Vietnamese started pushing out of Vietnam foreigners and pushing them onto boats and just putting them out to the sea. It became a scandal in the West, and I wrote them, I don't feel I can come while you're doing this. And then there were reports of famine. Some right-wing newspapers said the Vietnamese were trying to starve out the Cambodians. Actually, the Vietnamese were starving themselves. There was very little food after the war. But anyway, to my regret, I didn't renew my interest in going to Vietnam for 10 years. I should have gone there much earlier. 10 years later, I wanted to go to Vietnam. The United States was still making it very difficult to go. You couldn't get a travel agent to tell you how to do it. You couldn't make arrangements from Washington. I found a friend of mine, John McAuliffe, who had been running an organization called Reconciliation Institute for Indochina and trying to improve relations with Vietnam and Cambodia. And he said, I can help you. I run an underground railroad. I know how to do it. You got to go to Bangkok, pick up your visa there and get a travel agent there that'll permit you to make travel reservations. So he helped me, and I went. Now, at this time, the West, especially the United States, had not only decided not to recognize the new government, they decided to continue trying to overthrow it. And they found the three factions that wanted to govern Cambodia, and they pressured them to work together, something they didn't want to do, because one of the factions was the hated Khmer Rouge Pol Pot. So these three factions, which you're looking at here, there was Pol Pot's faction, the Khmer Rouge. There was Hun Sen's faction, he ran the Democratic Party. And there was Prince Sihanouk, king of Cambodia, eventually, and their prince, and he wanted a royalist government. So here were royalist forces, democratic forces, and super Maoist communist forces, told by the West, if you want help, you're going to have to work together, and we're going to give you secret aid. And the CIA was put in charge of this to get them to continue fighting against the Vietnamese. This all seemed good fun to some people in Washington until 10 years went by, and after 10 years, the Vietnamese said, you know, we've now set up this government. We think everything's under control. We're going to withdraw our army now and leave it to the Cambodians. It was just like our leaving Iraq or our leaving Afghanistan. At that point, though, in Washington, a lot of people thought, oh my God, what will happen now if these factions do overthrow this government? Which of the factions will win? And how is this going to work? Now, at this time, I was invited to Moscow to a meeting of a foundation that I had helped set up called the Survival and Development of Humanity that Gorbachev was setting up. And there was Russia was the big backer of Vietnam. China was the big backer of the Khmer Rouge. And so the Cambodians had sent their best man to be ambassador to Russia. And it was this man, Hornam Hung. And while in Moscow, I went and had lunch with him. And he turned out to be very cordial and intelligent and charming. And I thought, well, I'm going to invite him to Washington to explain the Cambodian point of view, which of course had not been heard. And he agreed to come. I called the ambassador, our ambassador in Moscow, Mr. Matlock, and I said, well, I've invited the Cambodian ambassador to Washington. He said, so? What are you bothering me with this for? I think he knew very well that the State Department wasn't about to admit this man anyway, so it didn't amount to anything. It took me 5 years to get permission for this man to come to Washington to express the Cambodian point of view. According to the law established in 2 courts of appeals, the United States government cannot refuse visas to people unless they are saboteurs, spies, or terrorists. And this was not a spy, a saboteur, or a terrorist. But one way or another, the State Department ignored those rulings, and they vitiated any efforts to get the Supreme Court to deal with it, because whenever a case was going to get to the Supreme Court, they just gave the guy a visa. So in this way, they were harassing entry to the country, anybody they really didn't want to see. So when I got to Vietnam, I met with Nguyen Thi Bien. Now, Nguyen Thi Bien, you may recognize her picture, because during the Paris peace talks, she was the foreign minister for the so-called Viet Cong government in South Vietnam. And so she was much in the news. Later, she was vice president of Vietnam, and I met with her. And at that time, I was also worried about what would happen if the Vietnamese army left Cambodia. I said to her, you know, what can you do for them, and what will happen to them? And she said, well, you have to understand, independence for us means we need to feed ourselves and clothe ourselves. And we have done everything we can for the Cambodians, and the international community is going to have to help them now. And while we had this discussion, this woman was sitting in a freezing room with a big overcoat over her, and I was freezing because there was no heat in Hanoi. They were extremely poor. At that time, if I had a Pepsi-Cola, it would cost $1 in a restaurant. And the dollar was a weekly wage for a scientist in North Vietnam. That's how poor they were. It's as if I was guzzling, you know, the most famous champagne when I drank this Pepsi-Cola. So they were very poor, and they felt they had done all they could for the... So then I met with the foreign minister, Win Kotak, who was a very urbane and interesting man, very witty. And he told me, you know, Dr. Stone, we are so poor that although I'm the foreign minister, I cannot afford a subscription to the International Herald Tribune. I mean, they had no foreign exchange. And by the way, I forgot to mention that because the Cambodian government was not recognized, it had no access to foreign aid. So you couldn't get UN developmental aid to the Cambodians because the government that wanted it in Phnom Penh wasn't the government they recognized. So they were impoverishing and cruelly treating the survivors of this genocide over this political struggle. Win Kotak told me an interesting thing. He said, you know, we have a Chinese section in Vietnam where they sell things, and we love to go there and shop because they set a fair price and they stick to it. Whereas in the Vietnamese markets, they haggle. It takes a long time to reach a deal, and you never know, really, whether you got a good deal or a bad deal. So we prefer to shop there. Unfortunately, he said, now that I'm foreign minister, I see that the Chinese don't do this in foreign policy. Instead, in foreign policy, they set a high price and they haggle. Then I met with the most senior military officer in Vietnam, General Giap. This is me, this is General Giap. General Giap was the famous winner of the war against the French in Indochina. He forced the French out of Indochina in the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which many of you older than me will remember quite well. He secretly maneuvered an army over areas no one thought were possible. He surrounded the French. The French asked for help from America. Admiral Radford said we should use nuclear weapons to free them, but the government wasn't having any of it, and President Eisenhower wasn't about to do that sort of thing. And so, so the French lost. And he told me, he said, you know, I was the defense minister during the Vietnamese War, but actually said that was a ruse. I wasn't really in charge of the war. They pretended I was the defense minister to scare the foreigners because they knew I had this, you know, fierce reputation. He said in order to win the war, we had to have the leader of our forces on the ground in South Vietnam, in tunnels, so he could relay messages quickly and maneuver with the Viet Cong and Vietnamese forces. So really, he said, I was a figurehead. I said, General Giap, I'm worried that the Khmer Rouge will come back and you know, we'll have this problem all over again. If this coalition wins the war against this Vietnamese installed government, against Hun Sen's government, and your army is gone, then I think the Khmer Rouge will overpower the Royalist faction and the Democratic faction, and we'll be in the soup again. He said, well, I've never seen a case where the criminals came back a second time, you know, after they'd been defeated. So that was his point of view. Now, my host was this man, President Nguyen Van Thieu. He was the president of the Academy of Sciences in Cambodia, in Vietnam, and I was the president of the Federation of American Scientists in Washington. So on that basis, we had protocol. And he had received me, he was my host, and I discovered to my amazement that he was actually an expert in elementary particle physics. Now, Vietnam was such a primitive country that they didn't have classrooms. I mean, people were scrolling chalk on sidewalks to teach kids, and I thought, elementary particle physics, it's pretty advanced for a very poor country. How did this happen? He said, well, when the war started, our government in Vietnam, they said, get some smart children, send them to Russia to be trained, because after the war, we're going to have to rebuild the country. We'll need scientists. So I was sent to Dubna, the nuclear laboratory, and I was trained in elementary particle physics. And he had actually won a Lenin Prize in elementary particle physics. It was amazing. I realized then that the Vietnamese, who are a Sinic people, you know, very closely related to the Chinese and the Japanese, they're all the Sinic peoples, they're very good at science. They're very good at science. And the Vietnamese no different from the Chinese in that regard. So he was my host, and we traveled down the length of, traveled by car from Hanoi down to Saigon, where I was going to get on the plane to go to Cambodia. And I learned a lot from him, and I invited him to America in a return visit. In the return visit, which came a little bit later, but I'm giving this picture now, I introduced him to a lot of people in Washington, including Senator Kennedy. This is me. This is Nguyen Van Gieu, Senator Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, and the Vice President of the Vietnamese Academy of Sciences. And Senator Kennedy gave me this picture. On my picture, it says at the bottom, "Jeremy will get normalization yet." At that time, the right-thinking people in Washington were all trying to get normalization with this, with the government in Vietnam, much less the government in Cambodia installed by the Vietnamese. I mean, it included all the war heroes in America, like John McCain and John Kerry, who later ran for president, and Bob Kerry of Nebraska, Senator Bob Kerry of Nebraska, who had lost a leg and won the Medal of Honor in a covert CIA operation in North Vietnam. The heroes of America in the war, they had bonded with the Vietnamese people, and they wanted normalization. So I was working on the side of what I felt were the angels in this regard. So I got to Cambodia. On the plane to Cambodia, I learned from a high official how the West had pressured these three factions to work together, hold their nose, and work together with the Khmer Rouge to overthrow this man, Hun Sen. And when I met with Hun Sen, he seemed very intelligent and thoughtful and didn't give extremely long answers. And they weren't highly Marxist. And I thought, this man is better than the Khmer Rouge, for sure. And this civil war is ridiculous. It's putting another war on the top of the Cambodian people. So I decided to support the recognition of Hun Sen and went back to Washington. Now, when I got back to Washington, 2 days before, something very dramatic had happened. The State Department had decided that with the Vietnamese withdrawing, they better send lethal aid to the royalist forces under Prince Sihanouk and strengthen this coalition, at least to make sure that the Khmer Rouge wouldn't take it over and to make it more likely that the forces the United States was backing would overthrow Hun Sen. So 2 days before I arrived, Stephen Solars, who was the chairman of the House Committee on Asia, House Subcommittee on Asia, and therefore the expert for the House of Representatives on Cambodia and Vietnam, he, a very vigorous and intelligent man, but very tough on people he didn't like, as you will see, he had made a speech saying we should send these arms. And he was going to push this through the Congress. I got there 2 days after this. And I went to the State Department, and I said, look, I want to talk about my visit. You have to understand, at this time, and nobody in the State Department had ever been to Cambodia. You know, I mean, not since the Khmer Rouge had taken over. And so it was one of those cases, as it happened to me a number of times in my life, where I came back from a country that we didn't recognize and went into the State Department and said, fellas, you want to know what this country is really like? I mean, you know, I've just been there and happy to tell you. Gives you a great sense of power when they don't know anything about it. They've never been there. And so I went in and talked to them, and they were refusing to speak to me except at the very lowest level. I discovered later they thought I had a message from Hun Sen, and they didn't want to dignify it with receiving me at a higher level. Finally, I got permission to meet with an assistant secretary through a friend, and the deputy assistant secretary was there too. Assistant secretary was very polite. Deputy assistant secretary was very rude, so rude that I became quite upset. I realized the State Department was putting a full court press on Vietnam and Cambodia, and that the people on this full court press were very abusive towards Vietnam and Cambodia. So the assistant secretary saw I was really quite upset, and he told this man, you call him and apologize to him, which was done, but was a pro forma apology. But I realized what I was up against. I began trying to see this man, Solars, but he refused to see me. And So I sent a letter to 3 secretaries of state. Secretary Muskie, he was retired Secretary of State. Secretary Vance was a retired Secretary of State, and Secretary Kissinger was a retired Secretary of State. I said, look, I've come back from Cambodia, and I think there's going to be another Holocaust. If this policy is continued, they'll overthrow the Vietnamese installed regime, and the Khmer Rouge will make short work of the other 2 factions, and we'll have the Khmer Rouge back. I didn't get answers from these 2 secretaries of state, but this one called a friend of mine. He had gotten the letter, asked my friend about it, and went off to Hanoi to look into it. And then I did something very important and very clever about this. I went to see Senator Cranston. Now, you probably all know Alan Cranston because he was a very senior senator in California. He was the chairman in the in the Senate of the Asia subcommittee. So he was the Senate counterpart of Solars in the House committee. So I went to him and I said, look, here's what Solars is doing in the House, and this is what the State Department's doing. It's completely wrong. Could you hold hearings on this situation? And he agreed to hold hearings. And this, as you'll see, turned out to be a really important thing. Because Solars ran everything in the House. Everybody was afraid of him. Nobody wanted to oppose him. He knew everything about the situation. They didn't know anything. They thought if they debated with him, they'd be cut to ribbons. So even the ranking member on his subcommittee was afraid to pick a fight with him. But the Senate, it was different. There, Solars was just another congressman. They were senators. Then I got on the Charlie Rose show. Now, Charlie Rose, you've probably seen him on these shows, so I got on there as to debate with Solars. So I thought this is my big moment. Solars won't see me, but at least I'm going to have a chance to debate with Solars. I didn't realize what Charlie Rose was really like, but I realized later and heard from other people that when you got on his program, he really favored whoever was the most influential person in Washington and dumped on whoever wasn't. And in this way, you could continue to get important people to be on your show and stuff like that. So he started asking Solars what he thought, asking Solars what he thought. He was never calling on me. Finally, I said, who's running this show? A remark that was taped out when the thing was shown in the evening. I was just about to take off my mic and walk off the set. Then he asked me a few questions. Solars was calling me an apologist for the Khmer Rouge, for the Khmer Rouge, so he was very abusive. But I felt I was working to save millions of people, so I thought I'd better be polite. And after the show, I said, Congressman, are you going to see me? He said, no, why should I see you? What do you know about it? And he turned on his heel and left. You should know that Solars had arrived in Vietnam and Cambodia several years before I did. And when he arrived in Hanoi, they were in the middle of a meeting of their central committee. And they talked to him at the airport, but they didn't invite him into the city, and they didn't make nice with him. He held a grudge against them. And when he went to see Cambodia and talked to Hun Sen was very newly appointed prime minister. And at that time, he was talking in very Marxist terms, you know. You have to understand, Hun Sen had been a 17-year-old schoolboy when he joined the Khmer Rouge. Everybody was supporting the Khmer Rouge, including Prince Sihanouk, you know, at that time against the government in Phnom Penh. It was considered a kind of heroic insurgent movement. People didn't realize what it was going to do. So all the farm boys were drawn into it. It didn't mean that they had wrong ideas. Anyway, so Solars said he wouldn't see me. And I think a big difference in what happened was that I came after him, and Hun Sen seemed a lot more palatable. And at that time, the Vietnamese were withdrawing, and the whole situation, the geopolitical situation, looked quite different. Then I wrote a letter to Gorbachev. I saw that Gorbachev, who was then president of Russia, was going to meet with Deng Xiaoping, who was then president of China. And I knew, so I wrote a letter to President Gorbachev, and I said, you know, Deng Xiaoping's backing the Khmer Rouge, and he's calling the Vietnamese cocky, dogs, and ungrateful, meaning China had helped them during the Vietnamese War, and now they weren't cooperating. And I said, your side, you support Vietnam, and by implication, the Vietnamese installed government in Cambodia. Maybe you could, please don't sell out the Cambodians when you meet with Deng Xiaoping, my letter said. Could you cut a deal with Deng Xiaoping? And here's my idea. And I said, you know, you begin to show more support for Prince Sihanouk, which will please the West, and asked Deng Xiaoping to show a little more support for the Vietnamese installed government and see if you can't close this gap. So I didn't think this letter, you know, you send these letters off, but you're never sure what happened. The Russian embassy called me very excited. They said, oh, we have a message for you from President Gorbachev. They were very unused to having leaders of Russia answer letters, you know, and it was a big thing for them. They said, we don't have the letter yet, but if you come over, we'll tell you all about what's going to be in the letter. So I went over there, and they said, well, you know, he liked your thing, and he said this, and told me all about the letter. And then later they called me back to get the letter, and it was a big thing for them. And I felt it was a pretty good thing, too. So then I got a chance to debate with the man who'd been rude to me in the State Department. And he had a Vietnamese wife. And I think she was very against the communist Vietnamese. All her friends had been forced out of Vietnam. It was part of the syndrome, I felt. Anyway, the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a very famous group, which I was a young member of, it had 1,500 members, and they had active debates. And they had, my friend was running the Washington section, and he organized my debate with this man, David Lambertson, who later became the ambassador to Thailand. So we had this debate. So this was a big moment for me. And afterwards, people said, you know, we have never seen a debate before the Council on Foreign Relations in which the speakers showed more emotion. Because as you can see, I was seized with the moment. I was in the middle of 3 years of working day and night on this, you know, because I thought this is my mission to save the Cambodians from another genocide. So I took it very seriously. They were used to diplomats who were giving a rather cultured, you know, dried assessment of the correlation of forces and stuff like that. And by that time also, another advantage of working on Cambodia was I had read every book written about Cambodia. You know what I mean? It wasn't that hard. There weren't that many experts, you know, and so I knew a lot about it. And people who were deputy assistant secretaries, they weren't just in charge of Cambodia. They were in charge of a lot of other things, Thailand, and, you know, they covered a whole section of countries. So I was ready for bear and knew a lot about it, and I felt I clearly won the debate, even though his friends had stacked the audience, and one of them had even gone up to help him and seized the podium to try to take some of my time. But I was very pleased with this. And then I got a debate in the Congress between me and the Pentagon's expert on Cambodia, and there were 4 senators and 14 congressmen, and there was the deputy assistant secretary in the Pentagon who was in charge of Cambodia, and he knew even less than the State Department, and he also had a very large range of things, and so I won that quite handily. So I felt I was making progress, and then this man Strobe Talbot on the left, Strobe was working for Time magazine at the time. Later, he became the #2 man in the State Department. He had been a Rhodes Scholar along with Clinton, and that's how he became the #2 in the State Department. But he was very influential even before he became Deputy Secretary of State by writing for Time magazine, and he wrote 3 articles supporting me. I fed him ideas, and he bought them, and I was intensely grateful and have been ever since. And then I got a debate with the assistant secretary. Now, you know, there's a secretary of state in the State Department, and then there's 7 assistant secretaries, and there are hordes of deputy assistant secretaries, and then there, you know, people are still lower on the desks of these states. So this was pretty good for me, Richard Solomon. But when I got to the debate, I discovered that for some reason he had reneged on willingness to debate with me. I think I would like to think that word of my debating prowess had penetrated to the highest levels in the State Department, and maybe he'd been instructed by the Secretary of State that it could be embarrassing to, you know, lose this debate. But anyway, I was called on from the floor and said, well, Jeremy, would you like to say something? And I thought, well, you know, I can't resolve this debate with one question, and so I said nothing and forewent it. And now at this stage, something happened that is tangentially relevant. Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer who did the Cosmos series and was at that time the most famous face in science on Earth, who loved this woman, Andrian, his wife, very dearly, decided to celebrate her birthday with a cruise, a 3-day cruise on a ship with 40 people on the ship traveling around. It was supposed to be a surprise for Annie, but since she paid the bills in the family, she soon saw these mounting bills for people that had been retained for hotels here and boats there. So it couldn't be kept secret from her. Anyway, BJ and I were on this boat for 3 days. And on the last morning, on the Sunday morning, we docked somewhere, I've forgotten where, and I raced off the boat to get the Sunday New York Times. And there in the Sunday New York Times, I found that I had won. 33 senators had said they would not support lethal aid to Cambodia. And I realized the power of getting Senator Cranston to hold these hearings and one of the senators was Senator Byrd, and he was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and that's where the money would come from. So the Senate Committee on Asia Subcommittee had trumped the House Subcommittee on Asia, and the State Department had been forced to withdraw the policy. So I was vindicated in this. At one point, since Congressman Solars wouldn't see me, I had seized the degrading opportunity to run into his wife at some meeting, and I said to Nina Solars, I said, you know, if your husband goes forward with lethal aid, I'll beat him. He will lose. People don't want this. She said, oh, well, he won't bring it up if he doesn't have the votes. And I think both of us were right. I did beat him, but at the same time, he didn't bring it up because he didn't have the votes, and the State Department withdrew the whole proposal. I should say something about Congressman Solars and my relations with him. Later, he was in a re-election fight in a new district because he'd been districted out, and it looked like he was going to lose. At that time, I was trying to stop the destruction of the state of Peru with another super Maoist group called the Sendero Luminoso. And I looked at the scene in Congress, and I realized there was nobody in Congress that cared about foreign affairs in detail, nobody with any energy, nobody would do, for good or ill, the kinds of things Congressman Solars did. He was a big traveler, he was very expert, he was a very smart guy, and he got involved in all these things. So, to my everlasting credit, if I may say so, I sent an unsolicited letter of warm endorsement to Congressman Solars for use in fundraising for him in his election campaign. And he was astonished because he felt that the two of us were at each other's throats. Certainly he had abused me left and right. At one point, Bill Colby, the former director of Central Intelligence, and I wrote an op-ed supporting my position. And I went to a meeting where he was speaking before the Asia Society, where they didn't let me debate him, but just put him on without a debater. He started talking about his position, and somebody said, well, what about Stone and Colby's position in the Washington Post op-ed? And he said something very rude about me, and I just walked out. So he'd been abusive to the end, but when I endorsed him, we became friends. He lost the election, but I see him from time to time in foreign capitals, and we're on a very friendly basis, and I learned a lot from this about you can turn enemies into friends, but it takes an emergency to get you to do it. Well, after that Sunday morning, the boat docked, and my wife and I got into a limousine. Carl Sagan had thoughtfully produced limousines to get you from the boat to the train or bus or wherever you were going, you know, the end of this 3-day cruise. And then something sad happened. The limousine driver turned on the radio, and I heard on the radio the announcer announced that my father had died. And so since he's connected to this in a small way, I show his picture. This is the medal that Harvard gives every year in his honor, the I. F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence, and this is the picture that was used to make the medal. You can see a vague resemblance. A famous sculptor did the medal, and that's, you see, he's a little more cherubic here than he is there, but it's not bad. But BJ and I put him through 3 or 4 redrafts before he did it. I want to say one thing about my father's relation to this talk. He was a radical, and I was a liberal, and we didn't work together in Cambodia or any of these other things, really. But he did one thing for me that, for which I am very grateful. When I started my career in this, it was 1961. There was a world emergency. It looked like there was going to be nuclear war. Children were being told to duck under your desks when the signal occurs, and how to fallout shelters were being advocated. And it looked like the Berlin blockade could bring on a general destruction of civilization. I decided to try to do something about this when a friend of mine called, my best friend from college and the best man at my wedding. He had been working at the Rand Corporation with Herman Kahn. Herman Kahn, he told me, was the most conservative, he was the most intelligent man, he said, I've ever met to the right of me. And boy, was he to the right of him. I mean, he was to the right of my roommate by leagues. He had written a book this thick on how you could win and survive a nuclear war. And he was giving 3-day lectures on this. And Scientific American had a book review by the book reviewer saying, could there really be a Herman Kahn? You know, it was a mixture of Dr. Strangelove and all these things. They couldn't believe there was such a person, but there was. But he was starting a think tank on War and Peace Matters. And my best friend said, I've been working with him. He has influence in Washington. He wants all kinds of people. You don't have to be trained in the subject. And would you go see him? And this was done over a ship-to-shore radio, because my friend, Sidney Winter, was on this ship, and he was saying these amazing proposals and saying over. And I was trying to handle all this and trying to think, you know, is this something I would sensibly do? Anyway, I finally did. I gave up my job as a PhD mathematician at the Stanford Research Institute and went to work for Herman Kahn. And in the School of Hard Knocks there, I learned my trade in working on war and peace issues. And so I never would have gotten into this if my father hadn't done one thing, which I'm not sure your fathers would have done for you. He didn't lift a finger against this. He didn't say, this is going to be very embarrassing if the son of I.F. Stone is going to work for this war criminal, you know, I mean. And he didn't say, are you sure you really want to do this? He believed in letting his children find their own way. And for that, I am very grateful. Well, that concludes my talk.